Greenberg. I am the Assistant Director at the Bureau of Housing and Support Services at the Office of Temporary Disability Assistance, and specifically oversee the Homeless Housing and Assistance Program. And I also get the nice title of President of the Homeless Housing and Assistance Corporation. So welcome. We're here this morning, to talk about nonprofit ownership. So on our panel today, we have Barika, the Executive Director of the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development. David Downs, who's the Vice President at Catholic Charities Development in Brooklyn and Queens. And Scott Short, CEO from Riseborough. There's a little snippet in your panel in the briefing. Specifically, Barika's going to give us a nice history on nonprofits in the community and that relationship and why it is so important. David's going to kind of take us through some joint ventures and what's good ideas, maybe like best ideas. And then Scott's going to give us some real life experience of things that have gone on in his agency. And then I will come back at the end and kind of give you a little bit of a state lens from anyone here who's familiar with the Homeless Housing Assistance Program. Only nonprofits can apply for our funding, as well as a big topic I know today, this morning, and after this panel is ESHI, the Empire State Support Housing Initiative, which also only nonprofits can apply to. And I was very lucky and honored that I could get Jason Harper, my colleague, to sit in this session and not go do something else so that I don't mess up and say anything wrong about ESHI. And then we'll have some questions and answers. So thank you. Barika, you're going to get us started.
All right, is this working? Hello, everybody. My name is Barika Williams. I'm the Executive Director at ANHD. And for those who don't know, Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, ANHD, is almost 50 years old. And we are the umbrella organization association around nonprofit affordable housing developers, tenants' rights, advocacy organizations. We were actually founded and created by 7 of the original CDCs and housing organizing groups across New York City. So we've been doing this for a while, and it was rooting it in the history. It was back when the only people in the affordable housing game in New York City were nonprofits, right? So up until this administration, we'll see, pending, we've had major housing plans from pretty much all of the past 4 mayors, right? So we've got Koch, Dinkins, de Blasio, and Koch, Dinkins, Bloomberg, de Blasio housing plans across those. And then there's one in the middle that I'll mention specifically. And so in the Koch and Dinkins housing plans, it was very heavily and almost entirely done by nonprofit actors. So that was who was building these affordable housing units. That was the entire really affordable housing market at the time. And that's where we have really the beginning and evolution of the community development sector here in New York City. The linchpin turning moment of that is Giuliani in the middle. And that's where we see a categorical shift and explicitly Giuliani designing his housing plan and marketing the development of affordable housing units to for-profit actors. So this is the original program of this is NEP, which many folks are familiar with now. Neighborhood Entrepreneurs Program is, I believe, what its name was back then, although that might have shifted slightly. And it was really Giuliani's approach to bring in private sector and for-profit sector into affordable housing development. That was his lens and his approach and his perspective. And since then, we have continued on that pathway. And despite different political frameworks, environments, different leadership, at no point in time since then have we ever sort of transitioned back to the origins of how we got to this point in terms of affordable housing development in New York. So at this point in time, we're at about 75% of our affordable housing projects, subsidy, new construction, and preservation all going to for-profit. It's pretty consistent numbers across the board. They vary plus or minus 5%. But at this point, about 75% of the market is occupied by for-profit actors, and the remaining 25% is done by folks like Scott and Riseborough and many of ANHD members and many of the network's members, and done by the nonprofit community and sector, which for us has a lot of bigger structural concerns, because we think about nonprofit ownership situated more broadly into something that ANHD talks about as community control, right? And how are we as communities, especially marginalized communities, immigrants, communities of color, senior communities, in a place where we're able to drive and direct what development looks like in the communities that folks live and reside in. And so when we think about nonprofit ownership, when we think about mission-driven development, we also think about things like community land trusts. We also think about things like I just said CLTs, about HDFCs. We think about some of the different ways, TOPA and COPA, if folks haven't heard of this, Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act and Community Opportunity to Purchase Act, where community residents are purchasing a building in order to preserve it. And really that comes from a lot of data and information that shows that projects tend to be more responsive to the needs and desires of communities when they're being done by community actors. We get deeper affordability, we get longer affordability, so how long the units stay in affordability. We tend to pay less for them when it comes time to reposition the projects. This is something that Scott and many others have a ton of experience, good and bad, around, but we constantly run into the challenge of having to overpay in order to maintain the affordability in projects where for-profit actors' design is to take them to market. And what does that look like, and what do we do as communities when we really need to keep that affordability? In terms of numbers, what this looks like is that we in New York City right now have over 200,000 affordable housing units that are due to expire by 2040. So we will have to figure out something to do to keep these units in affordability, or recognize that we're going to have a sea of units that jump well in excess of the 33% that we've been hearing talked about in the past couple of years, right? Or this past year as we see these big rent escalations. Many of those units predate some of the things that we think about now in terms of being rent regulated by their nature of being financed by HPD or HCR. So it's not necessarily that they can't go to market. Some of them absolutely can. So I think we really, ANHD has put an enormous amount of work and been a very loud advocacy voice for quite some time on the need to prioritize mission-driven development and nonprofit development. That this should be what we're doing first and foremost. And what we think about this is this is our public subsidy. It's our public value, and it should be going to actors who are invested and accountable to public and their communities first. That when we are putting this money forward as a city, whether it's in city-owned land, whether it's in subsidy, whether it's in tax breaks, that the way that we can be the best stewards of this as a city is to hand it over to people who have some sort of commitment and obligation to the community. And so I will stop there and hand it over.
Oh, no. We're going to move on to David and joint ventures and some guidance there.
Great. First of all, I want to thank the Shinny or the network team for the warm welcome and putting on another big event today. It's I'd say a little bit overwhelming to be back in the marquee and to see so many familiar and friendly faces. So I appreciate the opportunity. I think Barika hit a lot of the points that we as a panel had discussed in sort of bringing this to the network's conference, and this dates back a few years. The network and enterprise in 2018 had developed a joint venture guidebook, and a lot of the groundwork there was really thinking about how do not-for-profits approach being in a joint venture, not only with other for-profits but also with other not-for-profits. And I think the sea and sort of the landscape and the history that Barika laid out, the things have shifted quite dynamically even the last sort of 5 to 10 years. I think that was the impetus for the guidebook, and I don't know if folks in the room are familiar with it. It's a great resource. It's still on both Enterprise and the network's websites. And what it did there was to lay out sort of a variety of different joint venture case studies. And I think more importantly, as an appendix that we thought and sort of dived into and try to get to as many of the important details that everyone in this room would be interested in, it's provided a list of sort of considerations, questions that you should ask yourself when you go into this type of opportunity. So I think that's a little bit of the background. Fast forward, in my current role, which is with Catholic Charities, Progress of People's Development Corporation, we are an affiliate of Catholic Charities Brooklyn and Queens. The affordable housing team has a 50-plus year history. And most of that history has really been where we have developed our own projects from the ground up without really any type of joint venturing. And again, back to that 5 to 10 year window, the shift. When I first joined the team back in 2012, we were embarking on our first joint venture with CPC when they were working sort of in the development sphere. So it was relatively, that was our first venture and it was new to us. It's since been, I'll say, accelerated in the sort of the questions and the inquiries that we get about being a joint venture partner. So we can talk about that a little bit more once we get into some of the Q&A. But how we frame it, our approach to joint ventures, really, that was another question that we brought back to the network about, I think, 2 years ago, just sort of in a, hey, is this happening to other partners in the market right now? What are other not-for-profits seeing? What type of questions are they getting? Because some of this is taking us a little bit aside, the number that was coming up. So I think that there a variety of different factors have shifted or have shaped that increase in for-profits looking for a not-for-profit partner. Obviously, Dana talked about the fact that you have to be an NFP to be on her deals. Groups are coming to us to leverage not only our affordable housing development experience, but also to bring in our social service team, which is another affiliate or another leg of Catholic Charities. So again, every not-for-profit is different. We'll hear about Scott's experience with RiseBorough, but ours being a unique one where we have over 125 years of social service providing social services in the Brooklyn and Queens markets, leveraged with our affordable housing experience. We get these questions quite frequently, and we look at them judiciously. So we can talk about that a little bit more. I can provide a few case studies. I want to give Scott a chance to sort of give his sort of background and history with the projects that they've worked on. But I hope that this will be an interactive dialogue, where folks can ask about different models, different questions, and then we could take it from there. So I'll hand it off to Scott.
Yeah. All right, thanks, David. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. I'm Scott Short, the CEO of RiseBoro Community Partnership, and RiseBoro's almost 50-year-old nonprofit community development organization based in Bushwick, Brooklyn. And we do affordable and supportive housing, youth and education services, homelessness prevention services, senior services, and healthcare throughout the 5 boroughs. So in terms of our housing work, you heard from both Barika and David about how there's been an erosion of the primacy that nonprofits used to play in terms of developing affordable housing in the city over the last few decades. And I think just to put a finer point on why this is so concerning, for me, it's really because these are not, affordable housing buildings are not typical real estate assets. These are people's homes, and these are people's homes for people who don't have a lot of other housing options. They're also very often community anchors. You see senior centers, youth centers, nonprofit offices, publicly accessible open space. A lot of these projects provide so much more than just housing to their communities. And so to think of them as for-profits often do, and there's nothing wrong with being a for-profit or seeking a profit, but in respect to these assets, to me it's not appropriate to commoditize them, securitize them, provide a full range of financial engineering that you often see with big for-profit controlled real estate portfolios, because there is a need to preserve these assets as affordable in the long term, not just for the people who live there, but also for all the other public benefit that they provide. And there is so much public investment that goes into these projects that I think we really have an obligation as a city, as a public, to make sure that we're getting the maximum return on our tax dollar investments. And we really believe that nonprofits are the best stewards of these assets long term. So to talk a little bit about the experience that we've had, and one of the threats that we've seen to long-term preservation of affordable and supportive housing units, we've seen a disturbing trend in the industry of aggregation of limited partner interests in tax credit projects, and then certain bad actors within that, on that aggregator side, denying nonprofits right of first refusal to acquire the full ownership of the project at the end of the 15-year compliance period. So this gets pretty technical. I think probably a lot of people in this room have some experience with tax credits and with Section 42, so I'm not going to go into all the technical details. But essentially, when Congress set up the tax credit program back in the 80s, there was a clear intention to have nonprofits control these assets long term, which I believe was because of some of the same reasons that I just discussed about the need to preserve these assets affordably, the need to get maximum return on the public investment, and the belief that nonprofits would be the best stewards of these assets. So what we've seen as these projects, the limited partner interests, have been aggregated and financialized. Really, with the prices that many of these aggregators are paying for these interests, the only way that they can generate a profit from that is to deny the nonprofits right of first refusal, try to keep themselves in the ownership structure, and then upon the expiration of the extended use period, bring these units to market. So this is a big threat that we've been facing, and Riseborough has been engaged in the last couple of years with some high-profile litigation with one of our investors, and I am happy to report that we are very close to reaching a settlement. Can't announce the details today because we don't quite have pen to paper on it, but we're very close to reaching a settlement that would basically give Riseborough long-term control of these assets, and have the investor honor the right of first refusal that was initially agreed to 15, 20 years ago when these buildings were constructed. So I'm sensing and there are similar cases playing out across the country. There was another high-profile case in Michigan that was just decided in the nonprofit favor. We've seen cases in Washington State and in Hawaii also go in nonprofit favor recently. So I'm feeling like this is starting to become more part of the public conversation, and more awareness is getting put onto this ROFR issue, and we're starting to see that the courts are agreeing that nonprofits are the best stewards of these assets, that these deals that were struck when these buildings were constructed did have the intention of transferring ownership to nonprofits. And it seems like the needle is starting to shift back in the right direction. So that's some encouraging news from across the country. I know, many of you in this room and the network in particular were very strong allies in this fight to try to preserve the ROFR for nonprofits in general and Riseborough specific litigation here. So a big thank you to everyone who wrote letters, called legislators, showed up in support of our effort, and it does seem like it's headed in the right direction.
Specifically as a grant program for nonprofits and charitable organizations to serve homeless people. And we have morphed, our legislation has not morphed, so we are tied to that, but we have morphed and we have become creative so that we can all work together. 19 years ago when I got to TJP, tax credit deals were very slim, and now it's probably 75% of our portfolio, and these HHAP only are now the unique ones. So when we do a tax credit deal, we have to contract obviously with a limited partnership or a limited liability company, and we like the nonprofit, the applicant, to be the wholly owned subsidiary of that. In this joint venture world, that we see more, and I do see some for-profit developers and nonprofit developers out there that have HHAP. HHAP requires that 51% of the joint venture be owned by the nonprofit. That is something that our attorneys have determined allows us to be able to go back and say, yes, we're still awarding to a nonprofit, and then we can work things out. Obviously, HHAP only, then it's a grant, it's a nonprofit, it's a little bit less complicated. And then, as I mentioned, to talk about ESHI, I think ESHI takes a similar stance that the nonprofit would apply, and I think from an ESHI perspective and services, that makes more sense because there's not many for-profit entities that are providing the support services. Obviously, there is a rental subsidy that can be utilized with ESHI, so how that gets worked out, Jason, I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there are some some nonprofit developers who don't do the services, but they still get the ESHI and then they subcontract out the services or impose however they want to structure the rental payments. So one thing I like to talk about a lot, and Jason and I did this in the fall in our own kind of virtual conferences, what you're bringing to the table as a nonprofit. So listening to Barika, what you're bringing is you're in the community. It's your community, they're your neighbors, you're already serving these folks. You're bringing in HHAP. If you come through HHAP, we're open, we're accepting applications. Please feel free to contact me. And you're bringing support services, you're bringing rental subsidy, and from a landlord perspective, you're dealing with the tenants when they're in crisis or they're in conflict, and that's got to make any landlord's job easier because they don't have to possibly deal with that. And regardless of affordable housing or supportive housing, from the treasurer of my HOA, I'm dealing with tenant, homeowner conflicts every day. So it doesn't go away. It's not a unique thing just because somebody has other needs. So I don't want to open it up to questions, but that really rounds out kind of from the state lens on the nonprofit funding streams.
So I grew up in East Harlem, Spanish Harlem, and something I noticed as a trend there was that there had these new buildings that from the outside look luxury apartments, but they allocated the first, let's say, 5 or 6 floors to being low income, and then the above floors to be kind of like market value, privately owned apartments. Do you know if projects like that allow for nonprofits to also work in tandem with the for-profit sector, with a long-term solution of keeping that at bay, like these floors and they're yours, and then these the higher floors?
So, I spend entirely too much time on these. So like the big category vernacular for these, we call them 80/20s. Some of them have now shifted to 70/30s. That's pretty rare still, but it's a bunch of different types of programs. programs actually within there. The biggest one and the most common one, which is probably most of what you're seeing, is 421A, which is the state tax exemption program, which is actually, even though it is actually, well, I don't know who's in the room, but is actually in all likelihood less folks in this room, because that is mainly driven by for-profit, not affordable developers who are required to do some affordability, which I want to distinguish is not the for-profit affordable housing developers, right? So they are doing a slice of affordable housing as a requirement of their market rate building, as opposed to being a developer who does affordable housing but is a for-profit organization or a nonprofit organization. We should be at the place now where the floors grouping is technically illegal in New York City. That was poor doors, poor floors, that if folks remember this a couple years ago. So generally speaking, when you have those are older buildings where unfortunately they were built before that was banned. Technically you're supposed to space the affordable units throughout. They get to keep the top 25% because they want the luxury top units to sell at the highest price. But it is, I will say, what is going to happen with that type of housing is a very, very live, probably getting settled in the next 6 hours conversation. I mean that quite literally, because 421A is up for renewal and will or will not sunset June 15th, except session ends now, today. So we'll know whether or not this program is being renewed, whether it's going to sunset, and whether it's going to be renegotiated all sometime in the next 24 hours, basically. But it is a bigger, broader category, and I think something for everybody to keep in mind, which is, we are a part of a bigger affordable housing development sector, for-profits, nonprofits, faith-based, but within that, there are also a major part of this of affordable housing development, and who is generating the units is not a part of this conversation at all, right? They are not the folks who spend most of their time thinking about developing these units, and I think that goes to some of what Dana was talking about in terms of what does that mean in terms of your interaction with your tenants? How are you thinking about them? How do you communicate with them? How are you stewards of who's coming into the units, whether they stay in affordability, whether they don't stay in affordability. And one of the places we saw this very clearly was in COVID. ANHD works with, so Scott is our board treasurer. We work with folks like them all the time, and we got calls across the city saying, how do we find folks to be able to do specialized food delivery? How do we reach X, Y, and Z seniors? What the city very quickly realized is that these nonprofit developers are community caretakers. They're in those neighborhoods day in and day out, all the time. I see Riseborough truck drive down my street, right? I got my vaccinations at an ANHD member's site. So they are hosting a variety of different services in their community. And so when something happens, folks who are hesitant to engage with government will engage with Riseborough long before they'll talk to government oftentimes. And so as we start to cycle them out, as we replace them more and more with for-profit actors, which constrains their funding, constrains their reach in the community, we don't just lose the units, we also lose something much bigger than that. And I think when we see things like COVID, when we see stresses in communities, when we see climate disasters, and the question is, okay, how do we respond to something like that in Jackson Heights? Those are the people that we're turning to.
Hi, from Our Children. It's an organization that specializes in currently and formerly incarcerated mothers and helping them stay connected with their children, and we provide them supportive housing when they come home. A question about the first right to refusal. So any tips on being proactive to get ahead of that? I'm sure we can all agree there's no shortage of women coming home from being incarcerated with their children. And so it's really important to us to keep our units affordable and to not lose that. How soon would you recommend we engage in a conversation with our investment partners about this? Because we are hoping that we don't have to interact in this space in a negative way, but we want to be proactive in doing so.
Yeah, great question. I think The first thing you want to do is sit down with your attorney and take a good look at your partnership agreement or your operating agreement. These days, deals that are closing now, this issue is much higher on everyone's radar, so the language that's getting put into deals that are getting closed now is much stronger in favor of the ROFR for the nonprofit. But when you look at deals 15, 20 years ago, the language is a lot more ambiguous. And so it really does come down to a deal-by-deal basis in terms of how strong your language is. Now, even if you have ambiguous and weak language in one of these older agreements, you may still have a great investment partner who says they're going to honor the ROFR regardless of what the agreement might say. But I think you want to kind of establish internally how strong that language is in your favor, so that you know kind of how solid your ground is, what leverage you might have if it does get into a conflict situation. So start there, and then I would say, probably 2 years before expiration of year 15, you want to start having conversations with your investor and see where they stand. Hopefully you'll find that they're willing to honor that ROFR, but if not, you'll at least be prepared with what arguments you might have through the contract.
I would just also add, in like the last 3 years, we've worked very closely, to Scott's points about, start early with your counsel on new deals. It sounds like that's what you're looking at. We were able to sort of strengthen the language, and again, most of it is in our not-for-profit's favor now. We were also able to add other clauses where we specifically, struck other types of things where there's transfers, where we aren't given notice as a not-for-profit partner. And we went as far as sort of identifying what we call bad actors in the investment field, and said that any type of transfer to those would be under additional scrutiny. Now, each individual investor is going to handle that differently, and how much they'll let you work with them. So, again, to Scott's point, there's some that'll have more flexibility with that.
I actually would like to just add that, because being that you're our children, I don't know that the building you're specifically requiring is HHGP, but I know that there are some HHGP providers out there. So the two things I would say is, if you have an HHGP contract, whether it's tax credits or not, your contract compliance to New York State is actually 30 years to provide supportive homeless housing. So that means that our attorneys hopefully looked at the language to make sure that you have the right to continue to do that. And the other thing I would say is, if you're having these issues and you know that you have HHGP, because I don't know everything in our portfolio, and you can call me, but Brenda McAteer, who's not in this room, oversees our operational portfolio, and our in-house counsels could also assist, because we don't want to lose that. We don't want you as a nonprofit to lose it, but we don't want to lose it from our portfolio either. So when you're doing these tax credit and HHGP together, there is a longer commitment that everyone agreed to before our money went in. So if you have HHGP and you're having questions or concerns, call us, and we can hopefully help with our attorneys as well.
Thank you.
Hi, Greg Marr from the Leviticus Fund. I also want to ask a question about language. I think it was a few years or a couple years before you came back to AMHG, Barika, that you guys released a report called the For-Profitization of Affordable Housing, which I found was incredible in terms of new data and new analysis about the shift that you talked about and what the numbers really look like. And the gross gain in New York City, in particular, of new affordable housing each year is kind of undercut by a much smaller net gain as units come off and go to market. So my question is about language to people of influence, particularly political leaders on the executive level and on the legislative level, who tend, let's face it, not to have a long-term view of the world, because they're looking to their next election and the role of for-profits legitimately making political contributions and the impact that might have on policy. When we talk about this issue and the importance of preserving affordable housing over the long term and the role of nonprofits in that, which is so critical, what's, in your opinions, what's some really, really good language to use in talking to those legislators? What's the most effective language to use to
ANHD, with actually many other folks and partners have shifted to, which is why you heard me say this up front, is a broader framework of community control. I think one of the things that we understand as the folks, the legislatures, the executive, is that they are sometimes a little bit the nonprofit for-profit language doesn't feel as tactile for them, right? That's like classifications, so it feels a little like, which box are you on a form, and why do they as legislators really care? But when you talk about community control, then they understand that as the block association or the community board or the group of folks who come together as a part of a faith-based group, and they understand that those folks now have an interest and an investment in what is being developed in their community, and that resonates with them as politicians, I think, very differently. And also just recognizing power dynamics and where we are and the role and very long-lasting role of real estate in politics in New York City and New York State. It's a different, so ANHD does advocacy, so it's a different calculation when you're lumping together a bigger community of actors who are interested in advancing development that reflects their community, as opposed to when we're framing it just within nonprofits. Does that make sense? Because in our language and in our lens, that includes a church, that includes a faith-based organization, but that's not necessarily how it sounds for people. It's not necessarily what they think of. And so when we expand the framing, then all of those various different actors start to say, oh, that's me too, right? ANHD and the network work very closely together in a variety of different ways, but there is a time many, many years ago where, like, and we were talking about this in government, supportive housing is sometimes over here and affordable housing development is sometimes over here. We have shared interests, we have shared challenges. Many of our organizations are across each other, so we don't want to let the language guide and dictate that one is different than the other, right? And so I think that's some of what we're trying to think about. And another piece of this that is very important to articulate, though we're still trying to figure out how to frame it, this is a little bit outside of this panel audience, but is being discussed, is how nonprofit / community control as a big umbrella is able to articulate their racial equity lens. This is disproportionately folks of color in these organizations, disproportionately at a much higher level of women-led organizations, but we don't qualify as MWBEs at all. We're not corporations, and so none of us count for any of those projects. We don't count for any of those obligations or requirements. And so we are in this place where many of us are not able to move forward Black-led development or Latinx-led development, or whatever category it is, which is representing our community, because government doesn't understand it and doesn't recognize it because their box is, are you a corporation, yes or no? So I think that's also a very live conversation about how the city and or the state thinks about MWBE as an intersection to community control and nonprofits, because otherwise we continue to be excluded in a way that's not helpful.
That's amazing. There were other hands.
Hi, my name is Reggie Richter. I'm with the law firm of Richter Restrepo. We're an MBE certified minority, Black and Latino affordable housing community development law firm. I've had a chance to work with a lot of nonprofits and churches and even some developers on negotiating joint venture agreements. And obviously the Shinny guide was very good at giving you a sense of what's market, what's out there, because in every instance, the developer wants the absolute best deal they can get. And a lot of times there's an asymmetry of knowledge. And I often find, and also we do litigation, and so I've seen the opportunity to litigate in some of these deals years down the line and see how it really goes wrong. And so what enters my mind in every deal is, it's some point, there's some tactics, you know, that you go through to get a deal done, and you get it done, and there's always a point where I wonder, is this nonprofit really, did I do a good thing here? Are they really better off not just selling the land? You know, you can do a discounted cash flow, you can analyze that, but when I look at the risk and I look at some of the things that can happen post-deal, because you've got a marriage there, and you've got ongoing long-term cash flow management and decisions being made. I just wonder if you guys, your experience of looking at that post-deal joint venture world, what kind of things can be done or need to be done to protect these nonprofits long-term? Because, you know, I always say my door's open, but sometimes I walk from that table and saying, my goodness, what have I done? Am I going to see these guys in litigation in a few years because of what I've seen in the process? What are your thoughts on that?
I'll just jump in quickly, but I want to hear from Barika and Scott as well. That definitely was part of our, you know, consideration in the drafting of the guidebook. So again, thank you for referencing that and for using it in real life. It's nice to hear that. From our own personal experience in putting together joint ventures, it's something that we definitely are looking at. So we've already touched on sort of the long-term control. I think that there's different varieties and different factors in each JV, and this is where it gets a little bit sort of slippery. You know, it's what is the role of that not-for-profit in the JV? Are they going to be providing the social services? Are they going to be a management agent? Are they just going to be someone that's sort of silently at the table, you know, taking some cash flow as that's, you know, what's been developed? So I think that there's those considerations that, you know, you need to value on each, for each deal independently. I think for us, as a developer that marries both our social service provisions with our in-house property management, we are looking for, you know, long-term control, and, you know, we're going to make decisions in that 15-year window, if that's, you know, sort of what you're looking at in the post-world of litigation that's possible. We're going to be making, you know, informed decisions thinking about what this looks like at the end, not just what can we do to get by today. So, you know, Barika and Scott talked about, you know, the role of community control, the importance of being a steward. I think that, you know, all of those are things that you need to maybe be asking the not-for-profit when you're sitting down with them to say, where do you guys see yourself, you know, at the back end of this? Is this really what you want to take on? Are you, you know, capitalized and ready to deal with any of the things that can go sideways? Scott, I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I would add, you know, it's really important to have a thorough conversation up front about what each of the participants wants out of a project, out of a potential transaction. The concern you raised, we see coming up a lot in our relationships with churches. We've done a lot of development deals with churches, and I think for people who don't do this day in and day out, where affordable housing development is not their core business, they don't have a concept of how hard it is and how risky it is and how time-consuming it is. And so really, you know, laying that all out up front and making sure that if the church really wants to be, or the inexperienced nonprofit really wants to be a joint venture partner, like this is the time frame, these are the risks, these are the ways that it can go sideways, and maybe you're better off, you know, if this party is the one bringing the land to the transaction, for example, maybe you're better off taking the acquisition price and not having to deal with everything that can go wrong during one of these transactions. So I think, yeah, having that tough conversation up front is really important, and you know, sometimes you have to pull back from being the salesman about you know, wanting to partner with the less experienced nonprofit or the church, and really, you know, kind of talk about the realities of how difficult and time-consuming this work is.
You mentioned the word marriage, so it puts the legal team in the role of being a therapist in some ways. We talked a lot about that when we drafted the guidebook, so I see.
I actually have two
start? I don't want to say, I think you might have answered your own question and sort of, you know, all the issues that you know that are ahead of you in taking the leap, right? I think, you know, for Scott and I having, you know, 50-year organizations that we work with where people sort of paved the way for this in a different generation, where things were, you know, they were grant-based, there was no investment, there were all these, you know, strings attached. I think it's very hard to say, yes, you and your organization should fully take that leap today. So going back to, you know, the conversations and the considerations for, you know, a joint venture, you going into that, I think you need to think about your guarantees, your ability to sort of pivot and, you know, your mission. I think there's a lot of different pieces, and those are the decisions that we make for each one of our joint ventures. And I can't say that they're always evenly applied. I mean, there's certain opportunities that each, you know, deal or response might, you know, sort of elicit from us. I don't know, in, you know, the case of the project or, you know, pipeline that you're looking at ahead of you, if you have land that you're already working with, I think that's a big thing we haven't really talked about in this room today, is the role of not-for-profits holding land and other assets. That might be your big leverage. So I'll let Scott add any other points from his seat.
I would just say that I think marketing and lease up of new projects is probably the biggest pain point that we're facing in affordable housing development right now. I mean, especially in the city where you not only have, you know, ESHI on a project, tax credits on a project, you've got a homeless requirement, so now you're dealing with HRA and city FEPS. You've got Housing Connect, which is a disaster, to be frank.
Add in some project-based vouchers from NYCHA.
Yeah, some project-based vouchers. So you've got all these overlapping rules and regulations, and units are sitting vacant for months and months and months, which is undermining all we're trying to do. So
3 months right now in one building.
Yeah, it's got to be fixed.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
We've got people in shelter for 60, 75 days who are trying to get into an apartment, and you know.
And I think that to be fair to you and in a room of a lot of New York City folks, you're doing e-shine in multiple people's buildings. It's not like, right, you're partnering with us.
We have, yes, we have,
Some nonprofit, some for-profit, right? So
we have passed, yeah.
yeah. So, you know, the development, and you do operate your own building, you do have one, at least that I know of.
Yeah, we have 30.
So it's, you know, they're spread all over that community in some roles. So, you know, their points about whether you make that leap, you could still probably partner with the people you're partnering with, but have a seat at the table opposed to just being the service provider. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but more say in the development of something.
Can I add on to it, as I just support Housing Network, and we represent nonprofits, and part of the reason you see 1,700 people here today is because people did the hard work of developing and owning supportive housing, so now they're financially more secure. They're than a lot of nonprofits in the world, and they're at the table, you know, with government talking about changes. So, you know, they're players. And so we encourage nonprofits to, whenever possible, take that leap. Become a landowner, you know, have regular income coming in. I know there's risks. I know that there's a lot of things to think about. And we
nonprofit ownership is behind us, right? So Barika talked about that, like, that's not coming back. And so when it comes to joint ventures with for-profit developers, you know, I'm less interested in exploring, like, how do we protect ourselves, because we could talk about that, and you guys have done that, but you are both, David and Scott, you're both organizations that have the capability to do these things on your own, and you've chosen to joint venture, right? Because you see the writing on the wall. And so I'm curious how you have, like, what do you see as the positive components of the partnership other than survival and opportunity, right? What's the positive component of the joint venture that you see in entering into these relationships with partners?
Let me start. Yeah, I think the reason why we do a lot of joint ventures with for-profits, probably twofold, the top two reasons I can think of. One, they can just move a lot faster than we can when it comes to acquiring sites in particular, because of the way our governance structure works, and I think this is probably true for most nonprofits. We cannot make quick decisions. We are very conservative with our cash. We're not usually, you know, willing to put up a big deposit in a potentially risky acquisition transaction. Even if we were, it's going to take us a long time to make that decision. And the way that the speed with which development sites transact these days, we can't really be a player without on a private market acquisition without a for-profit partner. So that's oftentimes how we get pulled into a JV. I would say the other advantage, most for-profit affordable housing developers are also general contractors. Very few nonprofits are general contractors. And having that expertise at the table from the conception of a project, which is certainly your riskiest area that you're going to confront, is construction pricing, construction execution. We find that having that expertise at the table early, and then, you know, having that contractor as a partner, so they're vested in the success of the project, can help manage that construction risk a little bit better than if we're doing it on our own.
And Stephanie, I'd add special opportunities that we wouldn't necessarily pursue on our own. You know, there's been a big push with different city-led RFPs for as one example, where we've been approached by other teams in both a standalone capacity, so where we go in as a partnership and we, you know, are a driving force with other not-for-profits and for-profits to, you know, get through very tricky zoning changes and other sort of community conversations. So that was definitely a leverage for us. And another one where we went in sort of as an equal partner to marry with a GC, or to marry with the developer as a GC. So to Scott's point about having that access to someone that's going to have a little bit more control through the construction, and that's something where we don't necessarily, as our organization is structured today, don't have that deep of experience with owners repping and construction oversight. So having that partner be on our side and not feeling like we're sort of distrusting the process to happen, you know, and how it can sometimes go wrong, you know, thinking about the opportunity where we can really be learning from them as a relatively small development team through that process.
And so one thing I clarify, Stephanie, is I think the days of 100% of the affordable housing development market being nonprofits is probably behind us, even despite what maybe AMHD would like. But I wouldn't say that we're not going to necessarily change and shift from where we are now with the 75-25. And I say that that's part advocacy, part politics, but then the other two pieces of this that I would put in there are, one, to go back to what Scott was talking about, the commodification and the profitization, is that at a certain point, government is going to start to look a little bit askew at the RORs that people are getting on these projects that they're doing with government money. At some point, that's going to start to raise some serious flags, right? And that's already started to trickle and happen in different corners. it's just not, it's not gonna work, right? And people are much stricter with their LIHTC projects, obviously, so I'm not talking about LIHTC, but there's a lot of New York City specifically is affordable housing market that is not just LIHTC, and it's gonna start to become a problem. And then the other piece that I would say is just, we're gonna start to have a bigger fundamental problem with the disconnect between our New York rental population and what people are willing to build because they're looking for those RORs. The numbers just fundamentally don't line up. The vast majority of units below 60% AMI are done by nonprofit actors. That's most of who is doing those units. We're starting to push a little bit, right, in terms of deep affordability coming from for-profit actors, but it's still mainly done by nonprofits. That's 50% of New York City's rental housing. 50% of New York City's rental households are below 50% AMI. So if you have an affordable housing development market that isn't interested in doing those units, and that's about half of your renters, that's just a mismatch that we're not going to be able to sustain, right? So I think that's the other thing, and that's the piece that really resonates, going back to your question, that really resonates for politicians, because they know that that's ultimately who are their constituents and who they need to find units for their constituents. And so what they turn to is, who's going to build them? And if somebody is saying, well, I'm only interested in the 60% AMI plus units, then that becomes actors that they don't necessarily want to see, that they're less interested in seeing being in their communities and neighborhoods. They need the folks who are doing the 50 to 40, the 30, the homeless, the project-based vouchers, the HAVP units, all of those.
Good afternoon. What challenges and/or hindrances would an organization that's faith-based encounter if it doesn't take on the 501c3 designation?
With respect to affordable housing development or supportive housing development? So, I mean, the 501c3 designation for the faith-based organization itself is a good thing to have just to avoid tax liability. I think when you get into a development project, typically the faith-based organization is not going to be directly involved. They would form a subsidiary corporation. In New York City or New York State, it's usually an HDFC, which is a nonprofit corporation for developing affordable housing, and that could be controlled by the faith-based organization or another nonprofit partner. And so that's the entity that should be a 501c3 for the purposes of the development, because if there is cash flow that comes to that entity from the project, it can flow back to the partners tax exempt. So I think that's the importance of it on the development side, but the church itself doesn't have to be a 501c3 to have a 501c3 subsidiary.
Hi, I'm a little nervous, so I have a question. How can non-for-profits and developers work together to address the lapse in services for middle-income people and working families? I notice I have a lot of friends in the field. I'm in social services, and we talk about certain challenges that we face, and then we also talk about, like, we love the work that we do, we're extremely passionate, and then it's kind of like, hey, but I kind of need help myself. So it's like, has there been any discussion or conversations about, creating a development that possibly, like, I noticed in, like, Housing Connect, like, they'll have, like, a preference for, like, like something maybe like a preference for, like, social service or someone who's, like, not city, not working for the city, but more of, like, contractual service, like, something like that. Has there been any conversations about that? And how can I get more involved in my community so my community-based organizations can also listen to when I make those requests? Because, I've reached out, and, and of course my friends, we always talk about it. We're like, okay, what can we possibly do? We don't want to be priced out of, or not priced out, but actually have to move because, we're having these difficulties. And I don't want to throw any non-for-profit or organization under the bus because, like, best they can with the parameter and the funding that they do have. But there's also kind of like that lapse and disconnect, you know, as to like what this certain population can do to, you know, maintain their homes as well as provide services in the city that they really, really care about.
I'm gonna play my New York City ignorance and not having answer, other than I, you know, and I started in homeless shelters myself, and going to renting apartments much nicer than the people I was serving, right? It's a thankless, sometimes, career path, like school teachers, right? But I don't know, I do know that we do at HHAPC deals, obviously our money is supportive and for homeless individuals, which either they don't have income, but we definitely see deals where it goes above the 60% AMI, so I don't know if you guys can talk about that a little bit.
I'm not, I mean, I'll defer to Barika, she has her AMI chart out already, because I think that's, I mean, you know, we could do this as a collaboration. So I think the first question is, you know, middle income, that is a very sensitive topic in the city, you know, how you define middle income. In my previous experience working in Boston and Massachusetts, the state there defined it as a range of 80 to, I think, 130% of AMI, you know, with some fluctuation. I know that here in New York, when we think about affordable housing and then we think about middle income housing, anything that pulls away from low income or affordable housing, it becomes a really sort of big challenge. So, Barika, I don't know if there's anything else I'm missing that's available right now for developers or communities.
I think so we run into this challenge all the time, and absolutely hear you, and many of us are in a very similar circumstance, right? I think one piece of it is government, as we go back to government programs, and how government tends to structure programs, which is classifications that are low risk, which is why you get city employees, why you get school teachers, why you get NYPD. There's certain categories that feel like it's easy to monitor them, but they tend to get very uncomfortable with categories where they feel like it's a classification that they can't be sure somebody is in, i.e. essential workers, because that was a conversation. Why can't we do housing for essential? Well, who is that? What if this person counts? What if somebody was in the job for 2 months and then they hop out of it, and it's like, but like folks need housing, so can we just figure out the answer? The other piece of this is that we run into time and time again in almost every neighborhood across New York City is that what people understand as middle class for them in their neighborhoods and what we mean in middle class in terms of affordable housing are wildly different things. Wildly different things. And so in New York City, we say 130% to 160% AMI is technically middle income housing. For a household, I got my little cheat sheet, that's a household of about 3 people, that's about $140,000 to $172,000 a year. And your rent translates to about $3,400 to $4,200.
That's not.
Exactly, right? So I know exactly what you're gonna say, right? Because then you're like, I'm building middle, and people are like, but I wasn't asking for that. That's the first thing, they're like, that's not actually what I wanted. And we're like, we know. You know, so I think also the other real struggle that we have is that we consistently hear, especially from our communities of color, especially from our immigrant communities, that what folks are looking for is middle class housing, because that is like, I have a job, my partner has a job, my mom or whoever it is, we've got maybe a 2-income earning household, maybe there are kids, maybe there's a grandparent. You're like, I'm trying to not be stuck where I am forever, which absolutely makes sense. And then our rubric and what we tend to use in affordable housing development really is limiting people for where they can go next. It's not actually that what they're thinking of is like the next opportunity in terms of the numbers actually really isn't adding up. And this has become a very, I would say the place that we're, I think, digging in the most on this conversation right now is around the homeownership gap. Because many of the homeownership programs are designed for 60, 80% AMI, which that's like $85,000, right, for a household. The struggle is that what we found is most of the folks down at that point in time are not actually in the place to enter the homeownership market necessarily. And so we designed programs sort of a little bit below where people need to be. That's not necessarily true. Like Habitat does amazing deep affordability homeownership work, but that we do need to think about like how these things line up with the reality of who people are, what the families are, and how we need to create some like mobility so that folks can move at different points in time. But a very, very active conversation around, this is the biggest ask that we always hear is let's create a Mitchell-Lama 2.0. That's the proxy for what everybody wants, right? And the answer, unfortunately, still right now is we don't have it.
Any timeline around that?
Asking for a friend and myself. No, and I mean the real unfortunate thing is absent a huge influx of capital money. It's not clear that we would ever be able to repeat Mitchell-Lama again, right? But it just in terms of the dollars that we put in to create and establish Mitchell-Lama and what that would look like now again. You know, right now we're struggling, many of us, to keep the city invested in our current affordable housing capital commitment, let alone to increase it to be able to do these big, huge programs that actually, I mean, quite frankly, all of us know we need. Like, it's not you know, everybody is pretty much on the same page of like, well, yeah, it would make sense to be able to figure out how folks could be able to move into home ownership or stable rental housing at $2,500 that is not, you know, priced at $4,000.
I had a staff person not too long ago decline a raise because they were receiving assistance or affordable housing.
Yep.
And the raise was gonna put them a
Right
little
over,
bit,
yep.
like $5 over the, whatever their budget. And it wasn't enough to cover what they were getting on benefits, so they said, I don't want the raise. So, and I think about what barriers the system is putting in place for these people who do want to excel and do want to make more money, but will end up homeless trying to make more money, because if they're not if they gave up, if they took the raise and gave up their benefits, they would have lost their housing. So it's a crazy system.
Yeah, we're close.
We have a few more questions.
I'm just wondering, because both of your organizations also have addiction prevention work. As a nonprofit and you become a landlord, is there, just for the moral dilemma with that?
I think the question came, very vivid for I think every not-for-profit over the past 2 years, and all I can really sort of anecdotally say, not really being on the social service side that's dealing with that on a day-to-day basis, is that our portfolio, given we have a very high level of senior units and with a very large number of project-based or tenant-based vouchers. We were able to sort of stay very stable, sort of above the 85% rent collection mark for most of COVID. But I know that in conversations with other not-for-profit partners and different sort of dialogues that we're all engaged in, that was certainly not the case with other community-based organizations. So for us, it never became a issue that we had to tackle. But going back to my point about being a steward earlier, we take a lot of pains to try to keep people in their units as much as possible. And I think that, to maybe Greg's point earlier about how do you message this politically, we are, collectively the not-for-profit owners, agents, and, providers are really sort of serving as a backstop for a lot of things when, things like COVID or, the pandemic has happened. Scott, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
It hasn't really been a conflict for us because we almost never evict someone for non-payment. Occasionally we have to evict someone because they're just making life miserable for their neighbors. But I think one of the policy successes that happened under de Blasio and Steve Banks in particular is the expansion of rental assistance through one-shot deal, through home base, through other measures, so that there really are a lot of resources available to keep families in their apartment if it's just a non-payment issue. So we still have to start court cases because that's how you access a lot of these funds. But we usually are able to get the amount settled before we reach an eviction point. And our eviction prevention services actually can assist our own tenants, not with legal representation, but with financial help if they need it.
Question, Orange.
Yeah, I wanted to, we hear about incubators and accelerators a lot in the for-profit sector. What would it look like if a smaller nonprofit has a new idea, a new concept, and a larger nonprofit is willing to say, let's incubate that here and help you launch that? How would you begin to structure it correctly from that stage so that ownership is protected and kept in that model of smaller nonprofit and larger nonprofit?
I've one example we can point to. And this is kind of one of the solutions that we came up with to the problem that we saw of the erosion of nonprofit participation in affordable housing development, and that was the joint ownership entity of New York City called the JO for short. So this is a model, probably 6 or 7 years old now. Riseborough was one of the founding members, and the concept is to pool affordable housing assets among nonprofits to create an economy of scale that can make asset management more efficient. And what we've also been able to accomplish is getting the city to allow us to pool reserves. So with affordable housing projects, you're going to have some that are doing really well, that are really well capitalized, either because of the design of the program way back when or just because of good fortune. And you're going to have some projects that really struggle, that are underfunded. And so one of the key value propositions behind the JO is that we could bring these types of properties together, help pool resources, and those stronger properties could help support the weaker properties, and with the overall goal of permanent affordability and preservation in perpetuity. So that is a really interesting model that I think has helped to change the relationship between nonprofit affordable housing developers and government, and government is really bought into this idea that JO can help with our common preservation goals. So I think we have 11 or 12 members now. I'm actually the chair of the acquisitions committee on the board, so if anyone is interested in learning more about the JO, you can come up and talk to me. But that's one way that we kind of have tried to help support each other in the nonprofit field.
And then the other thing I would say, David and Scott, tell me if you think this is, if you disagree, but I also think the other thing to keep in mind is like the government doesn't necessarily give nonprofits a lot of space to be, to be that innovative all the time. Like the regs and the term sheets don't give a lot of wiggle room, quite honestly. And when they do, government tends to want to do that, to your point of the bigger folks, tends to want to do it with a nonprofit that they've had a long history with. It's very rare that they're going to take any kind of risk to do an innovative project with a smaller size-wise or newer nonprofit entity. And I think if for the folks who may be that smaller actor, just keep in mind that what you're asking the bigger nonprofit to do is that they're using up some of their currency and their capital with government, right? So there's only so many projects that you can fast track through, and there's only so many like in-depth, like let's be creative HPD conversations that they're going to engage with you at any given point in time. And so it's important to find the partner who wants to do that with you in that moment in time. Otherwise, you're going to start something and they may not be as invested in seeing it through. So I would just encourage finding somebody who seems really excited about what the project is.
I would just add, I think it's a great question, and maybe a whole conference in of itself, where people bring those ideas. I think if you have identified a problem, in working in whatever your relationship is, working with government or your community-based organization, what I've seen work well is when those problems are brought to a not-for-profit. Maybe there's some type of intermediary assistance from like an enterprise or a LISC, and it becomes a problem or a program to solve for. These may be short-lived, or these may turn into eventual, actual programs that you see at the city or the state side. So I'm thinking of, the Landlord Ambassador Program, for example. That was to really assist private homeowners with, serious arrears. It's also helping the city HPD to solve, backlogs of, liens on properties and properties with, problematic, landlords or, maybe units that aren't, up to the proper conditions. So I think working with a community-based organization or, a not-for-profit in that role in your community, and then trying to, sort of leverage that problem and taking it to government and say, hey, we have an idea and maybe a solution. How do we work this out?
Well, I just want to thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to be in a full room. I want to thank our panel
That was
again.
fast.